Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming along. Would each of you like to introduce yourself, please?
My name's Luke Johnson. I've been an entrepreneur and investor for the best part of 40 years. And I currently am the co-owner and the director of various businesses employing roughly 10,000 people.
Thank you. Ms. Lorimer.
Michael Lorimer, I'm the Chief Executive of DCS Group. We employ about 600 people. We're in the fast-moving consumer goods sector. So we have clients, well, the world's biggest non-food clients. So when you go and buy shampoo or shower gel or Fairy Liquid from a convenience store or a discount retailer, we've probably distributed it and indeed made some of it because we have a manufacturing division as well, which is quite unusual, I think, for a distribution business to actually invent a manufacturing business in the last 10 years. So, based in Oxfordshire and Redditch.
Thank you. Greg Smith.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. Good afternoon, gentlemen. This is a far-reaching bill. We've heard from the government, we've heard from other witnesses that it's potentially a £5 billion cost to the economy associated with it. Others have suggested that might even be a small c conservative estimate. What is, from the perspective of your business interests, the likely impact economically of this bill on the bottom line as well as overall job numbers in the economy? Mr. Johnson?
I think you need to put it in context. So I would say that in my various decades of creating businesses or jobs, that we now have among the highest ever level of tax burden and highest ever level of overall regulation and legislation. And this is a high-cost country. Job vacancies have been falling for at least 15 months. Unemployment is going up. Interest rates are massively higher than they used to be. Insolvency specialists tell me they are rubbing their hands because they think next year will be very busy. And I would say that even if perhaps we don't suffer a technical recession next year, it's odds on there will be a serious slowdown. And I'm at the cutting edge of businesses. And in some cases, some of my companies might not survive next year. And I don't know how many of the committee members have ever been involved in starting and growing and keeping a company from failing. It's not much fun. And the idea that now is a good moment for small and medium-sized businesses, which, let's face it, are the future. They're the ones that disproportionately innovate. They're the ones that actually disproportionately create most of the jobs. They're the ones that are the next big business. Every business started as a small business once. And the idea that companies that can barely afford any form of HR could stomach a big new bill of 150 pages and 28 measures, they won't even have time to read it. The idea that they can adopt something like this when they are facing quite possibly, you've got to remember they've got the hangover of 2 years when so many of them were shut. They have the legacy debts. They had energy prices. Electricity prices in this country are the highest of any developed nation. Try manufacturing things here now. And the timing of this, I think, is sort of beyond belief, really. And I think that needs to be put into context. So whether I could say whether 5 billion is the real cost or not, it's death by 1,000 cuts. Yeah. Because you never know until you get a big tribunal what the real cost is, for example.
I agree, and I think one of the things, to put it, obviously a bill like this doesn't exist in splendid isolation if you're running a business. Luke has identified the increased costs of doing business, which are severe and which do impact small to medium-sized enterprises most, of which, as you will be aware, represents 80% of the employment in this country. So the news yesterday of the white paper on getting Britain working as a top line, I'm very supportive of. I think it's absolutely brilliant. Getting 2.8 million people back into work is something I'm quite passionate about, in fact very passionate about. In the local area in which we work, in Banbury, we're right beside an area of quite a bit of deprivation, a lot of people in benefits, a lot of young people who are feeling quite depressed about life. And we'd love to be offering those people, I mean, I cannot emphasise enough, love to be offering those people jobs. 6 months of the year, we do have temporary staff coming in. And we're very glad they come. They come from different countries. They work very hard. They do great work for us. But my concern is, without being able to give you a number on it, is that some of those riskier hires that might come from the areas around where our business is based, in other words, NEETs or kids who haven't worked or people who've been unemployed for a long time, you hear it on the radio every day, people in their 50s can't get a job. Businesses will be very slow to take a risk because of the day one legislation that is coming down the track. And I think for us, we have an HR department, we can deal with it to some extent, but as you slide down the road a bit and find businesses that employ maybe less than 20 or 10 people, there will be deep concerns and perceptions that this is just too expensive and scary. And so I think I was encouraged, hugely encouraged by the white paper. I think the top line aspirations of that are absolutely the right ones. It's the same direction of travel that the Jobs Foundation have published a report on this week, 2 million jobs. CSJ are focused on it. I would exhort all of you politicians, regardless of your colour, to get behind the concept of getting Britain working. But my fear is this torpedoes a lot of those plans. Genuinely, that is my fear.
So in the modelling you've both done within your own businesses, and I certainly recognise the picture you paint of Banbury, it's very close to my own constituency.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've got people from Buckinghamshire on your
Yes.
payroll. What modelling and projections have you done that, on the presumption the provisions of this bill do become law and attain royal assent at some point next year, on employment numbers in your businesses?
Well, go ahead, Luke. Yes, please.
We're still grappling with the fallout from the budget. Millions of pounds of additional tax that some of my companies are going to have to pay. 6.7% increase in national living wage when average inflation is 2 or 3%. The idea that many businesses have already given deep thought to this new piece of 150-page legislation when we already obviously have things like the Employment Rights Act, the Equality Act, the Health and Safety at Work Act, and many, many other pieces of legislation. I dare say large companies have given it some thought, but most of the businesses I'm involved with are not quite so big. And I think it's, they will wait and see what the actual final result is to try and measure precisely whether it leaves the business smaller. And I think also you always have to remember with any piece of legislation like this, it isn't just the current jobs, it's the unseen. It's the jobs that were never created, the opportunities. And I urge you to look at the fact that for the first time, I think, in many years, the number of businesses being created in this country has been falling or stagnant for 5 years. That's more or less the first time in decades. And if we lose the full employment we've enjoyed and the enterprise economy that I think we've managed to create, and I believe it to be much more fragile than some might believe, then it will be incredibly hard to get it back. Jobs don't just fall from the sky. They appear because companies are created by risk takers, and they take a risk with every job they create. And jobs only exist because they are helping that business to progress. And 80% of the jobs are nothing to do with the government, they're the private sector. If you crush the private sector, you crush jobs. All the research shows that the single most important ingredient for a happy society are jobs. Without jobs, you don't have civilization.
Yeah, Greg, we have made our turnover is in the public domain, so I can share it with you. We'll probably turn over about £370 million this year. We're in a high turnover, very low, tight margin business. So if we make £10 million net, that's about the height of it. The increased cost of NIC, NLW, and making some provision, which is very difficult to do around the cost of this because not all of it is clear yet, will be somewhere between 1.5 and 1.8 million. So that's quite a big chunk out of our net profit. We don't have a huge problem with it. We're a company that believes strongly in being and creating prosperity. So national living wage is something that our hearts have no problem with, because we like to see people getting paid correctly. But we have to mitigate that. That's something that we just have to get on with. Our company has grown successively every year since it started 30 years ago, both in terms of top line, bottom line, and people numbers. And I need to stress again to you, the passion that we have is growth and job creation. And when we see people coming into the business and working their way through the business and earning more money and developing careers and actually prospering, that's what brings us the greatest joy of all. And my concern, and I have to repeat it again, is that smaller businesses than ours, which we, to Luke's point, at one stage were a small business, are going to find it very hard to get on that growth trajectory.
Minister.
Thank you, Christopher. Good afternoon. We've heard from a number of witnesses, including many from the business community, welcoming the intentions behind the bill, which is to increase workplace protections. Do you feel the current employment law landscape is too favourable to employees, too difficult for employees, or is it about right?
From my perspective, I think there's a pretty good balance at the minute between employer and employee. I'm sure you could unpick that, and equally there could be cases for either side. But as somebody who runs a business in quote unquote the fast moving, and in fact Luke Johnson's business is much faster moving even than ours, but in a fast moving environment where you're focusing on driving your business and trying to get results, I do think actually there's a good balance at the minute, and not particularly in favour of really tinkering too much with it, is my personal view.
I would slightly differ in that I think some areas are increasingly onerous for employers, and I think increasingly when I talk to entrepreneurs, they are looking to outsource or offshore or automate and not employ people. Not all of that is legislation and regulation. I think that post-furlough lockdowns, there is a vast amount of talk amongst employers and owners of businesses of workforce motivation. And I think it refers to one of the points Michael made earlier about the number of people actually, not in work, of working age and able-bodied. So I think this is an issue for society as a whole. And I think a happy society is one where people are productively occupied. I'm surprised that you say that many employers want greater protections for their staff. They're very entitled to give them to them if they want to. They don't need to rely on the government for that. They can just give them better contracts if they want to. I think that there are a number of concerning specific aspects to this bill which could, as I say, be counterproductive if the objective is to have higher living standards. And as I understand it, this government's priority is wealth creation and prosperity and jobs. I think ultimately, overall, although this legislation won't be devastating, I believe, to employers, I think it will be damaging for job creation, and therefore I think it will be counterproductive to wealth creation and higher standards of living.
Okay, thank you.
Sarah Gibson.
Thank you, Christopher. I must say I'm very glad to hear that you share my concerns for SMEs, and as you've probably all noticed, and it is in my declaration of interest, I have run a small business both here and in the continent most of my adult life. So I feel for them, and it was the first thing that came up once I started to read the bill. And I also noticed that you mentioned that you're concerned about day one rights, and I wondered about changes in the probation period. And it seemed to be an agreement here that it might affect where you draw your prospective employees from. And I'm just wondering whether there are any amendments that you might suggest to the Employment Rights Bill as we go through that you would like to see included that you think might encourage these entrepreneurial small businesses that we so rely on to continue to take on staff from areas of deprivation or long-term unemployed, or those areas that currently struggle to get work.
I was at a breakfast yesterday morning, and it was the launch of the Jobs Foundation's 2 million report, and a chap spoke from Sheffield who runs a business or an organisation that gets young people into work. And he gave the example of this kid, I can't remember his name, who really normally wouldn't find it easy to get a job interview. And they trained him and they helped him to get the right attire and to get him into a job. And the point he was making was he looked very risky. You know, he hadn't worked. He came from a long line of people who hadn't really seen any value in work. But he got the job because the people who were interviewing saw something in this guy that they thought was really worth working with. They knew they were taking a risk. They did. He's turned out to be an absolutely superb kid and is now progressing well through. Equally, yesterday I spoke to a friend of mine, a CEO of a business, who had somebody who interviewed incredibly well and did very well for the first 12 months, got promoted, and at about month 13 or 14 became an absolute monster to manage, and they were able under the 2-year rights to be able to sort that out. So my concern is, if you go back to the interview stage, as we all know, you can get that right or wrong in terms of hires. And for SMEs, you just need to give as much comfort and space for them to be able to hopefully get the right hires. But if they do get the wrong hires and it isn't the right fit, that there's an escape route. And I personally don't want to put a time on that. Our system works well for us at the minute, but I'm sure Luke might have an opinion on that.
Yeah, I find this big piece of, by my standards, big piece, 150 pages, that's a big piece of legislation. It's probably what you're used to, but I think if you're running a business and you've got 1,000 other things to do, reading a 150-page piece of legislation about employment, you know, and I find the whole thing rather surprised because I quote the Prime Minister saying he wants to rip up bureaucracy that blocks investment. If there is a genuine belief amongst the government that this legislation will boost investment, then I have a bridge to sell you.
Okay. Who's next? Lawrence Turner.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I do apologise to the panel for returning to an earlier dispute in this quite disjointed way, but just for the record, earlier this week, one of our witnesses, Paul Novak, said, "I do not think there's a direct link. You do not pass a piece of legislation and trade union membership and collective bargaining go up." And our other witness, Mick Lynch, said that personally he hoped to see 50% collective bargaining coverage. That's compared to 39%. Now it seems like thin margarine to me, and certainly not a unionisation of the economy, but there we go. My question to the panel is the same question that was put to employers' federations earlier this week, which is, I think we all understand the points that you have made, but are there specific measures within this bill that you do welcome?
No.
No. I'm not trying to be contrary. I think Luke's point is a very good one. 150 pages, 28 or whatever it is, new measures. It's just apart from anything else, it's an administration burden. And I welcome the white paper hugely, but there's nothing in here that I'm excited about.
I'll give you one example of one very specific issue that may arise to do with this that I don't think has been thought through properly, and it's unintended consequences. So there's an adjustment to collective redundancy rights, and this would, I guess, normally apply in a business that is going through a very severe restructuring and possibly an insolvency. Now, what happens in an insolvency is that a buyer can keep that business alive and keep a chunk of the jobs at least going through buying it out of administration. And the one thing that goes through an administration is the 2P rights of the employees. If you are only buying a small portion of that business, normally you can carve out only 2P rights relating to the staff of the bit you're buying. Say it's several divisions or departments or whatever. As I understand it, this will tighten that, as proposed, such that almost any buyer of any part of that business will face the 2P rights of the whole workforce. The unintended consequence, therefore, will be that parts of a business that could survive, that were good, will not. They will be shut. So the whole thing will be shut and all the jobs will be lost. And whoever drew up that part of the legislation, I don't think has fully thought it through, because it's in society's interest that where businesses can be saved and rescued, and I've been involved both sides in situations like that, then they should be, because it's always a great deal easier in certain respects to save a business that has failed because it had too much debt or some other problem than starting all over again from scratch.
Perhaps I should just add that there are aspects of it that I'm quite neutral or comfortable about. And there's some things around, bereavement, etc., which are all good. I should emphasise really that my focus today is around the day one stuff and flexibility.
Nick Timothy.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. I think it's quite conspicuous that you're the first two witnesses, I think, who actually run businesses yourselves.
Yes.
And your evidence is rather different to much of...
Have any of the other witnesses ever created a single job?
I'd have to leave that to them.
Well, I did think that we could have met in the Natural History Museum in the endangered species part of it as business leaders, but never mind.
Indeed. And with not just this bill, but with the increase in employers' national insurance contributions, things like the equalisation of the national living wage for young people, I think you also mentioned, Mr. Johnson, you mentioned energy prices, which are a particular concern of mine. You sound very worried about the future of innovation, investment, and ultimately jobs in this country. You have a platform today to send a message to the Prime Minister and to all the ministers who are involved in this legislation. So what would that message be?
I think there is a complacency about our current prosperity. I think that, there is this belief that jobs will always appear, that businesses will always invest, that living standards will naturally rise. I think it sometimes feels as if Britain is a nation running on fumes at the moment, and that we have large amounts of debt, certainly government levels. We have public spending taking, I think, or projected to take 45% of GDP, a very high level compared to what it was 10 years ago. That crowds out the private sector. As I said earlier, actually interest rates, especially if you have to borrow from the bank, are pretty punitive. The idea that we can continue to occupy the role we used to decades ago in the world, it's a dramatically more competitive place. There are dozens and dozens of more countries where money can invest and factories can be sited and jobs created. And many of them are much lower cost than we are. And they might argue they have, a hungrier workforce or whatever it may be. And if we regulate, no country has ever taxed and regulated its way to a higher standard of living. It feels as if that's what this government is about. And, they need to get real about how prosperous economies are actually created.
Yeah. I would say, if I was speaking to him, listen well to those who matter most. So, back to the white paper, you simply cannot create jobs without the private sector being on board. You can listen to all sorts of people who will give incredibly important stakeholder advice to you, but if you want to create jobs, if you want to grow the economy, the business community has to be on board. And if we want to create prosperity, the private sector is where it's going to happen. So I would say listen well to those who matter most. And I would say, secondly, take your time and consult widely on this, because I feel at the minute the consultation is not wide enough. We're here today, there's two of us speaking broadly on the same message. But take time, don't rush it through for the sake of trying to get a time scale met. Take time and speak to business. Go out to the country and speak to the small and the medium-sized and the employer groups, because a lot of this stuff isn't controversial and a lot of it is is reinforcing, I think, to the first question, a lot of stuff we do in the business anyway. We've 600 employees. At the minute, I think we've 3 people total on long-term sick. So we don't have a lot of problems. We've got an engaged workforce. We are delighted to pay people well above the national living wage. All of that stuff is about us trying to help people not only our people prosper, our customers and the Banbury community prosper, but it feels quite counterproductive and could have a lot of unforeseen consequences.
Michael Wheeler.
Thank you, Chair. So we've heard, as the Minister said, from businesses and their representative groups that said that good employers have nothing to fear from the measures in this bill, and in fact they welcome the level playing field to prevent undercutting. Given the purpose of this bill is to promote good quality employment, what specific measures in the bill do you think don't contribute to that aim?
Well, it's already been raised that I think if you introduce lots of rights like paternity rights and flexible working rights from day one, you risk having more problems, and that will be a cost. You know, for example, there's a new obligation to protect employees from harassment. I think that sounds wonderful, but if, for example, you're in the licensed trade, as I am, that means that a single remark from a single customer could lead to a harassment claim for which you're responsible. How are we on earth going to police that? And I don't know whether you're at all familiar with the state of the hospitality trade, but it's pretty dismal. You know, we had 2 years where we were barely allowed to open. We've had unprecedented energy costs. We have higher rates. We obviously have all the other NIC and so forth costs from the budget. And we have at best flat, if not declining, sales. And I fear that hundreds, if not thousands, more hospitality businesses will shut next year for good. That isn't obviously the fault of this legislation, but it's, you know, petrol on the flames. And I suspect a lot of the organisations you're hearing from are very large corporates who have huge HR departments, and in a way, you know, they want to keep out new, young, innovative competition, because that's how big companies often behave. And so building walls of regulation suit them. But that isn't how you get a growing, vibrant and innovative economy. You get that through lots of smaller, younger businesses growing and coming up with new ideas and challenging the incumbents.
Repeat the question again, Michael, please.
Do you want the specific bit at the end?
Just the end, yeah.
So given the purpose of the bill is to promote good quality employment, what specific measures in it do you think don't contribute to that aim?
I think it's back to this, what Luke's already said, a lot of this day one stuff. Now that, I don't want to paint a picture that we don't do a lot of this stuff already, because if we work on the basis that if you recruit well and train and develop well, actually you don't have as many problems down the line. But I think it's easy for us, because we have an HR department and we have legal advice, that if we do hit the buffers, we can deal with that. The perception, which of course is always stronger than reality for smaller businesses, that, you know, entrepreneurial businesses that Luke mentions, is I think it will create a lot of fear and concern. I was in a shop recently and it took a long time to pay for a pair of Bunnington boots, and I said, "Why is it? What, are you busy?" And he said, "No, but so and so left and we're just not replacing him because we're very fearful." Small business, 2 or 3 employees, we're anxious about what's coming down the line. So I think, yeah, you just need to be very mindful, and this is where this consultation piece comes, wide, speaking to people and seeing where some of the sore points are going to be.
I'm afraid that brings us to the end of this evidence session, because we are not allowed to go on beyond 22. So can I thank you both very much for sharing with us your knowledge and experience based upon your work as employers.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.